An old woman told us that the snake mountaineers most dreaded was the hoop, but that this kind was so very rarely met with that although she had lived in the woods all her life, she had never seen but one. If 1/10 the terrors with which her imagination invested this serpent are true, or indeed, if there is such a serpent at all, the presence of even one in the forest would be about as formidable as the fabled flying dragon.
I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey lurkers, welcome to episode 27. Today's episode is going to be about a little known cryptid from my home state of Maryland called the Snallygaster. Surprisingly, Maryland boasts several different cryptids, which is pretty amazing for such a small state. So the cryptids that I can think of off the top of my head in Maryland are the Snallygaster, the Dewey-O, the Goatman, the Sykesville Monster, and the Chesapeake Bay Monster known as Chessie. Those are the, 5 cryptid-type creatures that I can think of in Maryland off the top of my head. But today we're just going to be talking about this one. And before I get into things, as far as resources, my 2 main resources were newspapers.com, because I have found that newspapers.com is absolutely excellent for looking up information on strange creatures in the area, even ghost stories. There's a ton of information in newspapers because newspapers, that was your source of information back in the day. So I used newspapers.com, and I also read the book entitled Snallygaster, The Lost Legend of Frederick County by Patrick Boyton. So those were my 2 main resources. I also looked at a few web pages, nothing that really gave me any information outside of these other sources and the information that I already had in my own brain, because I'm from Maryland and I have known about the Snallygaster for most of my life. If you look up Snallygaster online, Wikipedia describes it as a bird-reptile chimera. Back in the 1700s, areas of Maryland were being settled by German immigrants. Early accounts claim the area was being terrorized by a flying monster called the Schnellgeist, which translates into fast ghost. Over time, Schnellgeist turned into Snallygaster, which is what the monster goes by today. I kind of like saying Schnellgeist better. 1735 is the first time the Snallygaster shows up. The fact that it's nocturnal is the reason some claim the sightings were few and far between. There's no written history of the Snallygaster before it appears in papers in 1909, but it was alive and well in the oral histories of the German immigrants. It was described as part bird, part reptile, with a razor-sharp beak. Some claim the beak was metallic and that it had teeth, but I don't really buy into that. Granted, that sounds like I'm buying into a giant reptile bird creature, but basically, my stance on cryptids, and this is my stance on cryptids across the board, is that there's usually some kernel of truth in there somewhere. That descriptions get morphed into crazier and crazier descriptions, but within those descriptions lies some basis of truth. It's like if you've ever played that game called Telephone, where one person has like a sentence or a phrase, and they whisper it to the next person, and then that person whispers it to the next person, and you go down the line, and the last person in line says out loud what the first person said, and most of the time, it's nothing like what the original sentence or phrase was to begin with. So that's kind of my stance on cryptids. I think that you get a lot of embellishments. If the right person is telling the story, they want to add their own little things to it. So within these stories and these descriptions, I think there may have actually been something that caused them. That's my opinion. This creature was half bird, half reptile, dragon-like, if you will, with a long pointed razor-sharp beak. Its wingspan was huge, some claiming it to be 25 feet. To give you a visual of how big 25 feet is, that's about 5 queen-size mattresses laid together end to end, or 2.5 stories of a building. That's pretty big. It had 4 legs and razor-sharp talons. Again, some say metallic. I just think it's because of the sharpness. A lot of the things said compared talons to like metal hooks. The beak was compared to metal. So I think that that's where the issue came in with people saying it was metal. That they were taking what was a comparison and saying that that was factual, that it wasn't just like metal, it was the metal. It had 1 giant eyeball in its forehead, and it had a screech like a train whistle. And all I can picture in my head is the one-horned, one-eyed giant purple people eater, and I'm going to be singing that song throughout the entire rest of this episode. Not out loud. German immigrants were said to be terrified of the creature. The one thing that was able to keep the creature away was a 7-pointed star that you painted on the barn. Now, if you go into the Pennsylvania Dutch area, which is, of course, in Pennsylvania, but it also comes down into Maryland, they were known to paint these designs on their barns, and they're referred to as hex signs. They were said to ward off evil spirits. Now, in research, there really isn't anything definitively that says, yes, they were used to ward off evil. There's more evidence to say that it had more to, they were almost like a heraldry type thing where it had more to do with the family and what the family did than warding off evil spirits. And I think some of that came from taking German words like hexa, which is witch, and it ended up getting all mixed up and confused. I'm kind of digressing, but I just want to make sure everybody has the right information. So anyway, these 7-pointed star hex signs were painted on barns, and they were able to keep the Snallygaster at bay. They wouldn't come after people in those houses, I guess. But I also read that the 7-pointed star had to be drawn or painted exactly right, or it wouldn't work. So I don't know. I'm not even sure how you do a 7-pointed star. I don't think it's very easy. Anyway, in the 1800s, tales of the Snallygaster made the rounds in Frederick County. The creature was thought to live in the caves on South Mountain, and it was known to steal small livestock such as chickens, small animals, and dogs, and even small children. It first appears in the Middletown Valley Register, February of 1909, and it was actually on the front page. A man by the name of Bill Gifferson was out walking along a country road when a flying monster dove out of the sky, grabbed him, and carried him up on a high hill. The monster then pierced poor Bill's jugular vein with its sharp beak and sucked the man's blood. When the creature was finished with its meal, it threw the body down the hillside and flew off. Word spread of Gifferson's death. The creature was also seen in the Hagerstown area too at this time, which is not very far from the Frederick County area. A man by the name of George Jacobs was out hunting when he saw a strange creature with large flapping wings. Jacobs shot at it, but the bullet bounced off the tough skin as though it was made of steel. This, of course, angered the creature, because really, who likes being shot at? And the creature turned and began chasing the terrified hunter through the woods and fields, snapping its razor-sharp beak at the nape of the man's neck. Jacobs narrowly escaped by being able to find cover in a stable and slamming the door shut. The following night, a Mrs. Augustus Rothrauf was in Williamsport on her way home when she saw the creature. Instead of talon-like claws, she said it had hooves. She also said that it had a long tail like a dragon. The creature didn't stay within the confines of Maryland. It also traveled out to areas around Shepherdstown, West Virginia. It was seen perched on a cliff about half a mile outside of Shepherdstown, and then it was also seen perched on the railroad bridge the night before. One of the engineers on number 83 said it had an elastic neck and a very long, sharp beak. The government allegedly planned on sending troops armed with a Gatling gun to try to kill the Snallygaster. The Smithsonian wanted it alive, and President Teddy Roosevelt considered postponing his African safari to hunt the Snallygaster instead. He didn't. He ended up going to Africa and was able to get like 1,500 different specimens for the Smithsonian instead. But it would have been really cool if one of them had been the Snallygaster. Then one of the newspapers received a letter from T.C. Herbage of Casstown, Ohio, dated February 9, 1909. A gigantic monster passed over this place last night about 6 o'clock. It was plainly visible, had 2 immense bronze-like objects as wings, an enormous head from which horns protruded, and a tail 20 feet long. It emitted a noise like the screech of an octolopus. Some who saw it declared it to be a snallygaster. The monster was moving toward Maryland. From the brief view I had of it, I think it was either an octolopus, a gigantilodius, or a snallygaster. I have no idea what a gigantilodius or an octolopus is, but they sound terrifying. Sometimes this legend just really makes me shake my head. People must not have had a whole lot to do in 1909. I mean, you didn't have any internet or anything. You barely had electricity. What the heck do you do in 1909? Not much. So, it's been seen in Maryland. It's gone over in West Virginia. It's been seen in Ohio, apparently. Then there was an account of a man who was working at a brick burning kiln in Cumberland, Maryland, which is out towards western Maryland. And he found what he called an immense bat drying its wings over the outlet of the kiln. When the man approached the creature, it let out a yell that could be heard a mile away. It flapped its wings in anger, and the wind generated by the flapping wings knocked the man over. The creature flew over to a giant tub of water used to fill the boilers in the brick plant, and it drank its entire contents, which was nearly 100 gallons. Then, apparently, the snallygaster spoke and said, "My, I'm dry. I haven't had a good drink since I was killed in the Battle of Chickamauga." For those of you who don't know, the Battle of Chickamauga took place September 19th through the 23rd in 1863 in south central Tennessee, which is about 600 miles from the kiln, and it was a solid Union victory. It's thought that the addition of the Chickamauga comment was added to add some color, courtesy of the newspaper's editor. So apparently what was determined is, and I'm sure all of you are completely shocked by this, but the creature didn't actually speak. And it was not reincarnated after it died in the battle. That's something that the editor added to the story after the fact. Why you need to add that in, it's already pretty freaky to have a giant creature who just drank 1,000 gallons of water. Another man claimed the snallygaster flew over his neighborhood one evening around 6 p.m. and sucked up and ate all the goldfish in a pond. Reports began coming in regarding snallygaster eggs. One was alleged to have been laid somewhere between Sharpsburg, Maryland and Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And just so you know, these two towns are really not very far apart. They're actually across the river for the most part from each other. And I know that because I've traveled that way a lot of times. I've been in this area a lot. Not snallygaster hunting. I don't know that I could actually say I've been officially snallygaster hunting ever. Another man asked the Middletown Valley Register with help procuring snallygaster eggs to hatch. Apparently there were some thieves stealing chickens near his home, and he thought perhaps raising up some snallygasters and turning them loose might deter the poultry rustlers. The paper did not follow up with the request. March 5th, 1909, Ed Brown, who was a railway employee, was sitting outside reading when he heard a loud noise in the area of the coal bunker. Now, stealing coal was actually one of the most common petty larcenies in the winter months. Completely understandable if you have somebody who might not have enough money to purchase coal. I can totally understand why people would go and steal it. They had plenty of it there at the railway. So, Ed Brown goes to the coal bunker and he sees that there is coal missing. As he's about to go in search of the thief, the snallygaster swoops in. It seized poor Ed Brown by his suspenders. Luckily, another local, Bill Snyder, happened to drive right up at the right time and saw Ed hanging by his suspenders dangling in the air, and of course, Bill runs to Ed's aid. Bill grabs Ed by the foot, begins a quick tug of war until finally the suspenders snap and Ed falls to the ground. The men said the wings were ghost-like, and they beat wildly as fire shot out of the creature's nostrils and singed the ground. Ed, Bill, and another man named Dan Shorb fought the creature for an hour and a half before chasing it off into the woods. So now we have this giant reptile bird, long sharp beak, one eye, maybe talons for feet, maybe hooves, giant wings, long tail, and it breathes fire. Totally a dragon, which is a little bit cooler, I think, than a snallygaster. Snallygaster just really doesn't bring up something that's terrifying. The one eye doesn't really terrify me a whole lot either. It doesn't really strike fear in my heart. Fire breathing? That's a little scary. So in a letter to the editor of the Middletown Valley Register, The writer claimed that the Snallygaster was part of an ancient species from the center of the earth that was unleashed by an earthquake. It was said it was released during a recent quake in Italy. Supposedly, according to this letter, scientists went to find evidence of the creature, eventually seeing a bright light on the summit of South Mountain. As the team approached the cave where the light was coming from, they heard a strange noise like a steam calliope, or the wailing of lost souls. Just so you know, a steam calliope is a steam whistle musical organ, and it was used to attract attention for circuses and fairs at the turn of the 20th century. The loud, shrill sound could be heard for miles. Following the noise, the scientists saw flashes of flame coming from a fissure in the mountain, and the flames eventually died away as dawn broke. Believing the creature to be nocturnal, the scientists returned the following evening. Eventually, while they waited, the ground rumbled and the earth split, shooting flames into the air, and the Snallygaster burst out of the crack. That doesn't sound right. The crack in the ground. There are so many jokes here. I'm really trying to be an adult. It's really difficult. The creature was described as a cross between a jackass, a hyena, a baboon, and the devil, having a forked tail, immense horns, cloven hooves, fiery eyes, and a screech like a steam siren, and in a size equaling an elephant. The creature took off toward Shepherdstown, and ended up bathing in the Potomac River, and then disappeared into a cave on the Virginia shore. When morning came, the monster returned, and its horns were covered in blood and gore. It returned... Who wrote this? I did. It returned to the flaming crack and wasn't seen or heard from again for 23 years. The flaming crack. One thing I do want to point out is that in episode 17, where Angelina and I talked about the Jersey Devil, it was mentioned that there was a frenzy of sightings of the Jersey Devil in 1909 and that it crossed into several states. The states that I mention are New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware. I think those are the few off the top of my head. But it was a huge frenzy. They actually shut down businesses and closed schools in New Jersey in 1909 because of the amount of sightings that were going on. So while this is very silly, and I have a hard time doing this with a straight face, I think there really actually was something going on here because people were in a panic over this, and it all coincides around the same time. And even though some of these descriptions are a little crazy, I think there's certainly a possibility that something strange and uncommon was seen in the skies in the area. I don't think the hysteria would be able to spread like it did otherwise. So I think it would have been too hard for a mass hysteria to spread from New Jersey to Maryland all within the same time frame. You have there's no internet. There's no way to communicate like today. So that's hard for a lot of people to really understand, especially for those who have always lived in a world with cell phones. But for those of us who didn't have cell phones, you weren't readily available to information 24/7. I mean, a cell phone is basically a mini computer as long as you have a smartphone. I mean, I do know people who still have flip phones, but you've got a mini computer that's available to you 24/7. Most people are on their phones nearly 24/7. So today, I totally could see mass hysteria spreading between states like that. Back then, not everybody even had telephones in their house. So the only way to get information typically was through the newspapers. And it sometimes took a couple days for news from one state to get to another state. So there had to have been something going on. There was something seen in the skies for all of these strange winged creature sightings to be happening in so many states at the same time. That's all I'm saying. So November 11th, let me just reiterate, 23 years. 1909, Snallygaster comes back, its horns, because now it has horns, are covered in blood and gore, because obviously it's gored something to death, and it goes back in the fissure, and they never hear from it again. Fast forward, November 11th, 1932. Headline appears, Strange Monster Mystifies and Alarms Persons Living in South Mountain Section. The article said that residents of South Mountain saw a strange creature flying over the area. It was said that it would change color and size and at times throw out long streamers like the arms of an octopus, only to draw them in again and sail out of sight. The creature maintained its distance and it made no effort to harm anyone. So now we have the creature. showing up. It can change color. Apparently it can change size. And now it has funky octopus tentacle arms that can be stretched out and drawn back in again. And all I can think are those little, I don't even know what they're called. The things you get at parties that make the noise and that you like blow them out and they unroll and they go, me. That's all I can think of, that this thing has a bunch of them in his mouth and they're just blowing them out. And anyway, this episode's really going to be a great one. Let me tell you. 2 weeks later, November 25th, 1932, Charles Maine and Edward Leiter were frightened by the creature when they saw it flying over the highway towards Catoctin Mountain. Both said that it appeared suddenly from the south and was no more than 25 feet in the air. Mr. Maine said that the creature changed color several times from white to black and threw out long streamer-like arms of an octopus. The wingspan was around 12 to 14 feet. They eventually got the nerve to go check out the area of the mountain where they say they saw the creature fly to, but they found no sign of it at all. 2 young boys also sighted a strange flying creature in the area of South Mountain, but they didn't wait to get a good look at it and instead took off into their houses, which is probably a good thing because the Snallygaster was known to eat small children. I don't know how big these children were, but they were good to run. The new Snallygaster sighting stirred up memories of a creature seen 50 years before, which would be in the 1880s time frame, and they referred to it as a Jabberwock. Now, if you are into literature at all, remember from your elementary school literature classes, maybe middle school, you might be familiar with the name Jabberwocky, which was the title of a Lewis Carroll poem written in 1871. One line was, "Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch." So apparently, 50 years previously, which predates the 1909 sightings, they had a creature in the area that they refer to as the Jabberwock. The December 1st, 1932 edition of the Frederick Post had a story about one of the city's residents who recalled a panic much like the Snallygaster panic. Stories were told of a face that would appear looking in the windows of homes. The face was described as horrible. The creature was often seen climbing the area's high fences. Children supposedly screamed whenever the name Jabberwock was mentioned, and they were forbidden to be outside after sunset. For months, people were on the lookout for the monster of monsters. So again, we have people scared enough. There's something looking in their windows, climbing over their fences. It must not have had wings at this point, whatever they're seeing. It's terrifying them to the point that their children, they're not even letting the kids out at night. The kids can't go out at night. So something was going on. There was some sort of creature apparently in that area. December 12th, 1932, the Middletown Valley Register reported about the demise of the Snallygaster. Apparently, the Snallygaster was attracted by the fumes coming from a 2,500-gallon vat of moonshine mash. The creature was overcome with the fumes, and it fell into the vat and died. George Danforth was in charge of the Hagerstown Prohibition Office at the time, and it was Danforth and one of his agents, Charles Cushwa, who reported the demise of the creature. Danforth and Cushwa had received word of the illegal still, and when they arrived in the area, they found the operation abandoned and the skeletal remains of the Snallygaster. The mash had eaten away the flesh of the monster. The flesh was eaten away because there was lye in the mash. Now, I looked this up when I read this because I'm thinking, who puts lye in alcohol? But apparently it was not uncommon for moonshiners to add lye to the mix in order to fool people into thinking the alcohol was actually a higher proof than what it was. Lye is a strong alkaline solution, either potassium hydroxide or sodium hydroxide, and it could be made by leaching wood ash with water. Lye has many applications. It's used in food curing, soap making, making household cleaners, and for digesting tissue from animal carcasses. So the fact that they said the carcass was eaten away and there was only skeletal remains left would not be unreasonable to say that. I'm not saying the Snallygaster fell in the vat and died. I'm saying if something fell in the vat and died, it would not be a stretch to say that the mash was able to dissolve the fatty tissue from the skeleton. So the skeleton was lost when Danforth ordered the operation destroyed and had it blown up with dynamite. But perhaps the creature had laid and hatched eggs, because in July 1934, a man named Edward Lewis was experiencing issues with chickens disappearing. He suspected the culprit was the, quote, large strange bird that locals were reporting seeing coming down from the mountain. His suspicions were confirmed when he encountered a creature he said was 4 to 5 feet tall with a wingspan of 6 feet. Its beak was 4 inches long, as were its claws, so its claws were also about 4 inches long. He shot the creature, and even though it was wounded, it attempted to attack one of Lewis's children. Lewis fired a second shot, and the creature left. People speculated that because of the size, this was a baby Snallygaster. This is really starting to remind me of the Jaws movies, because, Jaws died, but then Jaws had a baby and it came back and it ate people, and then it died and it had a baby and came back until there were 4 movies. In a travel book of Maryland from 1940, there was this mention of the Snallygaster, and this is a direct quote. Residents of a Negro settlement south of Frederick, near the distillery, are firm in their belief that the neighborhood has a Snallygaster, a fabulous reptilian bird of vast size that preys on poultry and Negro children after nightfall. I'm not really sure why it seemed important in this travel book to mention specifically a Negro settlement being involved, and I'm using the word Negro only because that is in context with this selection from this 1940 travel book. Because the Snallygaster really did not seem to prey on one area of town or another. It was seen by many different people from many different backgrounds. So I don't really know why that this particular travel book seemed to single out only one group of people, but I did want to include this information from 1940, the mention of the distillery, the mention that it does prey on children. And that's going to bring us to 1947. And of course, we're going to mention the UFO craze. So in 1947, this was like the year of the UFO. UFO fever was crazy. This was the year that Kenneth Arnold had his experience that we talked about in episode 3 of the UFO Ranch. And also it was mentioned in episode 23, The Men in Black. This is also the year that Roswell happened. So everybody is seeing flying saucers. In fact, the Pacific Northwest and New Mexico were not the only places that flying saucers were to be seen. Bruce O'Hara was in his backyard in Frederick, Maryland when he saw 5 UFOs flying in formation towards Washington, D.C. This, of course, reignited conversations about the Snallygaster, because apparently now the Snallygaster and UFOs are one and the same. In a letter to the editor of the Baltimore Sun, Charles Stein suggested that the Snallygaster and the flying saucers were one and the same. He claimed that a flying saucer seen over Hagerstown was identified by an astronomer as a Snallygaster. He also said that a farmer, who remained anonymous, encountered the Snallygaster 4 times, 3 of those times while hunting on South Mountain and once in his barn. The farmer said that the best and only protection from the beast was to paint a 7-pointed star on the barn, but the star had to be accurate or it wouldn't work. As I mentioned, the star designs on barns are not uncommon in this area. They're called Hex Signs. They originated with German immigrants, also known as the Pennsylvania Dutch. In the 1920s, people started saying that the Hex Signs were to ward off evil, but those who adorned their barns and buildings with them insisted that they were only for decoration and even were some type of heraldry, which I mentioned earlier. Still, it's widely known in Maryland that a 7-pointed star and a hex sign keeps you safe from Snallygasters. A 1949 newspaper article talked about a cow attack in Gunpowder Falls, which is an area of Baltimore County, Maryland. So the Snallygaster really didn't stay just in South Mountain. It was seen in several different counties. It was seen in Frederick County primarily. It was seen in Washington County. It was seen in Carroll County. And it was seen in Baltimore County. So this account in 1949 in Gunpowder Falls mentions that a cow was attacked and its tail had been removed. The only clue that they had about what had attacked it were tracks that were left. It said that the pad of the track was as big as the mouth of a water tumbler, so I'm guessing like a glass, the top of a glass. So the pad was as big around as the top of a glass. and there were claw marks extending out from the pad. Now, most people thought that it was a wildcat or a mountain lion, but I do want to point out that if you look up photos of a mountain lion or any type of cat print, cats do not leave claw marks in their footprints. The only animals that do that would be, the only known animals that would do that would be a dog, some type of canine, dog, wolf, coyote, fox, or a bear, which doesn't sound like this footprint was that large enough to be a bear. But it would not be a cat. Cats do not leave claw marks in their footprints at all. This 1949 account was the last time I saw any actual account of anything that was attributed seriously to the Snallygaster. And that brings us to the speculation part of this episode. What exactly was the Snallygaster? I have a lot of theories about this. There were some descriptions that I purposefully left out of this episode, but I do want to mention them. There were some mentions that the Snallygaster was seen riding a bicycle. I think that there was a lot of embellishment on the part of the media because people were in a little bit of a frenzy over this creature and they really wanted to build the hype. So like he said things to people, like in the instance of the brick kiln worker who saw this bat-like creature that drank all the water from the vat, and then supposedly the creature said, he's been thirsty because he hasn't had a drink since he died at Chickamauga. But that was pretty much attributed, the addition of the spoken word was attributed to the editor of the newspaper. And it seems like a lot of these crazy things that were added on to embellish the story on the part of the newspaper. I don't think anybody saw the Snallygaster riding a bicycle. Also, I do want to mention, before that, I want to throw out there, and I can't believe that I'm going to be the person to throw this out there because I think it's silly. We've had several different creatures have been explained away by this one known creature. And of course, I'm talking about everybody's favorite, the Sandhill Crane. Now, I just want to point out the two biggest things. I'll say three. The three things with the Sandhill Crane, or any type of heron or crane-like bird. You have the long neck, which the engineer on number 83 mentioned an elastic neck. So picture in your head like a great blue heron or a sandhill crane. They have a very long neck, and it can go from being pulled in close to its body to being stretched out very long. It would have the appearance of being elastic. You also have the descriptions of the very long, pointed, sharp beak. Herons and cranes all have that same very long, pointed beak. And with sandhill cranes, you have the red patch on its head, which possibly could lend itself to the description of the one large eye in the middle of its forehead. I'm not saying that it was a sandhill crane. I'm just playing devil's advocate here and throwing out a possibility. This is where I really stress that I think that there is some actual creature that is being seen, but the hysteria in the area and with the help of the newspaper, everything is being blown out of proportion and embellished. In 1934, there was actually a report of a hunter who killed a strange bird that was about 4.5 feet tall and had a wingspan of about 6 feet. It was a bird that they were not familiar with. So it just proves the point that there are animals out there that may be out of their typical migratory pattern that aren't known to people in the area. And then they turn them into monsters, especially if something else happens. If somebody's losing livestock, losing chickens, somebody dies, it's easy to blame it on a strange creature that you don't know anything about. But I really do feel that there is some basis of a creature that happened at some point in the area. The Native Americans, and a lot of times I look to Native American myths as a way to see if this is something that might have been around for a long time. I don't really want to bring up Bigfoot, but I'm going to. Bigfoot has been in Native American stories and in their petroglyphs for centuries. They have a creature, Sasquatch, and to me that lends credence to the fact that there is a type of creature in the woods. With this, there is a large bird creature that was known as the Piasa, and it was kind of like a thunderbird, a very large bird. And the Piasa bird was referred to as a demon and a Native American dragon, which is how it was depicted in a couple of murals that were painted by Native Americans on the bluffs above the Mississippi River. So the Native Americans did have some type of creature they referred to as a dragon-type bird called the Piasa. Native Americans did not make up cartoons and draw it on the cave walls or the rock ledges. They only drew what they saw in nature. So if they're drawing this strange dragon-type bird, they've seen this strange bird. So that leads me to believe that perhaps there was something that people were seeing that was the Snallygaster. Was it one of these thunderbirds? I don't know. This is where this tale ends, and oddly another begins, because many claim that the Snallygaster went from a flying dragon creature to a Bigfoot or Dogman type creature known as the Deweyyo. But that's a story for another day. Thanks for taking the time to listen. As always, you can find Lurk wherever you listen to your favorite podcast or at lurkpodcast.com. On the website, you'll find all the episodes, plus links to our social media. Please take a moment to like or follow us on one of those platforms. We also have a new Facebook group we welcome you to join and share in some discussion. You can find the link to that group in the show notes or on our Facebook page. We also have merch, and you can find that at lurkpodcastmerch.com. Be sure to check back next week for a new episode, and as always, keep lurking. It returned... Who wrote this? I did. It returned to the flaming crack and wasn't seen or heard from again for 23 years.